Universalism logically implies the existence of a single voice, as it is a viewpoint transcending time and space. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2015, talking about Canada as the first post-national state. He said, "We're no longer a nation in the old sense of having to rely on a history and a character of a nation, because we are actually now defined by our values, hard work and caring for each other, and so on." Another example would be Prime Minister Mark Carney's book, Values. The subtitle is called Building a Better World for All. And so Carney and Trudeau are both universalists. In Carney's book, he lists these values: dynamism, resilience, sustainability, fairness, responsibility, solidarity, and humility as essential values upon which we need to build our country. Universalism has a natural attraction to us when on the surface we see beautiful words that seem to be true for all people at all times in all places. So both left and right have a tendency towards universalism. And again, universalism is this idea that we can come up with words or ideas that are true everywhere and at all times for all people. The claim of universalism promotes the assertions that the precepts be taken very seriously, that they are capable of transcending particular boundaries, that deviation from them is wrong and possibly dangerous, and that discourse about them can be discontinued.
Concepts with Sean Buckley.
Okay, I want to talk today about a tricky concept that I think is central to understanding what's going on in politics today. And it's a concept that almost nobody's talking about. The concept is known as universalism. So this is a definition from Michael Freeden, who's a political philosopher. He puts it this way, quote, "Universalism logically implies the existence of a single voice, as it is a viewpoint transcending time and space," end quote. And he goes on to explain that it bestows an, quote, "unchallengeable authority on the view from nowhere," end quote. We find an example of this when we see Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2015 talking about Canada as the first post-national state. He said, "We're no longer a nation in the old sense of having to rely on a history and a character of a nation, because we are actually now defined by our values, hard work and caring for each other, and so on. So we're now a post-national state." Now, many of us, when we heard that, bristled at him saying that we're a post-national state. But at the same time, if you look at the values that he talked about, you would say, okay, well, those are good values. I agree with that. Another example would be Prime Minister Mark Carney's book, Values. The subtitle is called Building a Better World for All. And so Carney and Trudeau are both universalists. In Carney's book, he lists these values: dynamism, resilience, sustainability, fairness, responsibility, solidarity, and humility as essential values upon which we need to build our country. And when you read those values, you would say, yeah, that sounds good. I agree with those values. We also find this idea of universalism baked into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? You read through that and you see a bunch of words and rights that sound aspirational and they sound good. And you think, yes, I want to get behind those. Freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom from oppression. We see the same kind of language in the Declaration of the Rights of Man around the French Revolution. So universalism has a natural attraction to us when on the surface we see beautiful words that seem to be true for all people at all times in all places. And even on the right of center, you'll find people talking about, certainly in conservative circles, you'll hear people mention peace, order, and good government. And those are the central values that we base our political philosophy on. On the left of center, you might hear people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are the central values upon which we should build our society, and those values should guide all political decisions. So both left and right have a tendency towards universalism. And again, universalism is this idea that we can come up with words or ideas that are true everywhere and at all times for all people. And again, Freeden puts it this way, quote, "Whoever invests moral or political values or beliefs with universal rationality is implying that they deserve to be scrutinized in a certain manner, and that every right-thinking person should and would adopt them. The claim of universalism promotes the assertions that the precepts be taken very seriously, that they are capable of transcending particular boundaries, that deviation from them is wrong and possibly dangerous, and that discourse about them can be discontinued." So on the surface, you might read that or listen to that and say, well, that just sounds like someone being dogmatic. That just sounds like someone saying, I passionately believe these things to be true. They are self-evidently true, and we should spread the good news around the world. It almost sounds a bit religious, right? You hear Christians or Buddhists or Muslims, now different faiths proselytize to different degrees, but it has that flavor to it. It almost has a flavor of, I'm certain that these are right, and now I'm going to spread the truth of this around the world. The problem with it is that we take these truths and treat them as metaphysical abstractions. So they exist floating in an ether of just simply metaphysical rationality. The way Edmund Burke put it is this way. He said, "We need to avoid, quote, all the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction," end quote. So to the conservatives, I would say, all right, you say peace, order, and good government. Those are the values that you're aiming for. Those are the principles that guide you. But tell me, what kind of peace are you talking about? And when you press your conservative friends, they're going to start explaining peace, perhaps in the Anglo tradition. They might talk about stable government, habeas corpus, the rule of law, private property, and so on. Now, if people appeal to a history or other events to explain the values that they promote, then they are no longer grounding their ideas on universalism. So their ideas aren't simply naked definitions, metaphysical abstractions that float in space. They actually are specific and particular to a certain line of history, a certain experience of a people group, perhaps the last several hundred or 800 years of the English tradition. And so that version is not universalistic. That version of ideas or basis of our ideas is particularistic, and it's focused on a particular time. The opposite to universalism is to situate your values and ideas in a particular history and experience of a country, a people, or a region over time. And that particular experience is contingent. It could have been other than it is, but through trial and error and experimentation, we have something that has been proven through time to work well and to lead to human flourishing. It's this time-based understanding of a particular value that leads us to put extreme importance on the nation. The nation isn't simply a collection of people living in a particular area. It's actually a collection of people who rely on an inheritance that they've received, good and bad, for the last many, many hundreds of years before. It's a bit like learning English. We all have to inherit a language from people who've come before. You can invent new words and maybe they'll catch on, but for the most part, the words that you use are inherited. They're inherited definitions, and you have to actually learn them. You submit yourself to the use of those words, to the language and grammar and syntax involved in a particular speech. You don't simply have language existing all by itself without a history packed in behind it. So I wanted to try to get at how this concept of universalism drives through the center of politics. So President Donald Trump's speech to the Saudis given just yesterday. He spends a lot of time talking about how countries need to be built by the people who are in them. One of his quotes is this, quote, "The so-called nation builders wrecked more nations than they built," end quote. And so he's taking aim at the neoconservatives, essentially, who thought they could bomb Iraq, set up elections, and if they did that, a liberal democracy would spring up and free markets would flourish. Well, we've learned the hard way that that doesn't happen. It takes a lot more for people to come about and organize themselves in such a way that a liberal democracy emerges, let alone a free market. And yet, if we look at Trump, certainly given all the things that he's done, many of us would say this is a wild man. He's not making sense. He does crazy things like comes up with a tariff one day and then the next week stops the tariff. You can't make sense of what he does. However, his speech to the Saudis, I thought, was a good example of him taking something other than a position of supporting universalism. He's saying that the values we have in America, or he has in America, actually are going to be different than the values the Saudis have and the approaches that the Saudis have to building their government. And he didn't want to be part of influencing or building a nation from the outside. He would like to support them building their own nation from the inside. Now, it's terrible that Trump offers the best example of a current politician operating in a way other than the common universalism that we see in most politicians. I'm sure other examples exist, but you won't be as familiar with them. So that's why I offered Trump as an example. This concept of universalism has been a struggle for me personally. Perhaps it's coming from my educational background, right? When we're in school, we are taught a definition, we memorize a definition, and we figure we know something because we've actually got the definition. But that's actually how we learn something. When we're actually talking about creating knowledge or developing and expanding what we know, that process happens more by trial and error and experimentation and failure. Sometimes a scientist will have an epiphany and wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I think I've solved the equation." We can come up with ideas that maybe they had a dream about it or their subconscious was solving a mathematical problem. But the bottom line is, in real life, when you're actually coming up with new facts, new ways of understanding things, they don't proceed in the way that we learn them in school. So they don't proceed as a definition that just floats in space, untethered to anything else that came around it before or after or at the same time. In medicine, this comes up in the realm of bioethics. So Tristan Englehart's book on bioethics, the first sentence of it is, "Bioethics is a plural noun." And I remember reading that and thinking, "Oh, something bugs me about this. Is this guy a major relativist? Is he saying that there is no truth and there are no ethics?" And he's couldn't be saying anything farther from that position. He's not a relativist. But he is saying that there are different bioethical norms depending on the community that you look at. Now, that would be a position of pluralism, but not relativism. Famously, when the explorers first found the island of Hawaii, they were having a meal and the men and women were eating together. And the Hawaiians thought this was very immoral. How could these men and women share a meal at the same table? And yet the explorers looked at the Hawaiians and noted how they would talk explicitly about their sexual experiences with their marriage partners, and they were horrified at how immoral that behavior was. And so we have two cultures coming in contact with each other that have very strong moral opinions about what is ethical, and we have no basis upon which to say one is absolutely right and one is absolutely wrong, other than the way that ethical or behavior has developed through time within that particular culture. Now, for those of you in the audience who are of a faith tradition, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or some other faith tradition, you might say that, hang on a second, there are some things that are absolutely true everywhere and at all times. And so my background is Christianity, and I certainly thought that way for a long time as well. Love is love, no matter where you are. However, if you press even a Christian to say, well, what exactly do you mean by love? Those of you who have studied that word realize, well, there's actually 4 words at least with different meanings. You can have familial love, love between friends, sexual love, self-sacrificial love. And so you actually have to start unpacking what that word love means. Furthermore, for a Christian, you end up going back to a particular point in history, 2,000 years ago, and talking about a man that walked the earth and taught, and you have to look at what he taught and look at what the people wrote down about what he taught. So you're looking at the life and times of Jesus Christ. And that's where you're developing your understanding of what love means. So even for a Christian who says, well, God is love and this is a universal truth, most of your primary beliefs are situated in a particular historical tradition that you cling to and that you use and rely on to develop an understanding of what your concept means. And I think this is why in the past people weren't considered educated unless they actually learned Greek and Latin, because you needed to know the whole of Western history to be able to understand Western civilization. Whereas now we think that we can just learn the definitions of words. We don't need all that history. And so the assumption in modern society is that universalism is all you need. Let's get practical. We don't have time to learn all that history. And you're just as good at being a doctor, saving lives, being a nurse, being a policeman, teacher, whatever it is, if you just know the definitions of things. Given that, though, that leaves us in a situation where we have metaphysical abstractions, to use Edmund Burke's term, and we have people then essentially writing books about values like Mark Carney's book, and then insisting that because his values are self-evident, he now has the authority to go ahead and push forward his vision as long as he gets elected by, 43% of Canadians cast a vote for him. That gives him the authority to push forward his vision of reality, as opposed to the conservative approach, which would be to say, no, wait a second, we've got 800 years at least of history, rule of law, common law based in the English common law tradition, habeas corpus, Magna Carta, stable government, private property, all these major ideas and concepts that we have to pay attention to as we apply the values that we think we understand, because often we don't understand them when it actually comes time to apply them. Universalism is core to understanding what's going on right now. I hope this at least has highlighted for you the need to pay attention to universalism, to do some reading about universalism. It's a bit of a tricky topic, but it's a pillar of liberalism. And I think this is one of the sharp dividing lines between philosophical conservatism and philosophical liberalism. I hope this helps. Talk to you soon.